Welcome to the second guest episode in the Culvey podcast series. Today's guest is Dr. Andrea Brown-Thurston, an expert in access and experience-centered curriculum design, and the founder and CEO of Optimal Learning Solutions, an innovative and contextualized education consultant. With over 2 decades of experience across K-12 schools, public school systems, universities, and nonprofits, Dr. Andrea has led transformational work in instructional coaching, educator development, and culturally responsive education. Whether she's supporting public schools through systemic redesign or building tailored digital learning strategies, Dr. Andrea is always focused on one thing: making education work for all students. In this episode, we dig into what it takes to go beyond simply performative work in education to contextualize it, how to rethink success in schools, and why experientially informed and personally focused curriculum is incredibly important for both students and educators. Okay, hi, Dr. Andrea. It's wonderful to get
Hi,
to speak with you
Karina.
on this podcast.
Yes, I'm very excited to do the podcast, especially since I've just started my own. And so this is perfect timing to see how other podcasts flow and have a conversation about all things equity in education.
Of course. Yeah. Thank you so much for being a guest. And you've done so much work in education, and we'll get to talk about it, of course. But I want to start by sort of discussing how your experience has shaped your understanding of the work you do. So, sort of my first question is, from classroom teaching to, of course, executive leadership to launching optimal learning solutions, how has your understanding of impact in education evolved over time?
Sure. So I would say I've started noticing patterns and trends in all of the various places that I was in. So, from graduate school, well, even pre graduate school, I had a job for 2 years with a nonprofit organization, and it was a school to work program, and it was basically pairing high schools, CPS, Chicago Public Schools, with kind of career development opportunities for students. And this was seen as a way to engage students who were might otherwise not be interested in school, in traditional school. And so I was able to learn about education policy, but also learn about just what it looks like on the ground to implement. So you would read these very lengthy grant descriptions and also work on proposals, small sections as a team. And then you go out in the school and you would see where the disconnect was. And a lot of times it was, even if there was funding attached to it, you realize very quickly that it wasn't enough funding. And you realize that there were so many gaps and holes in the structure of how we do school, how we train teachers, the bell schedule of how a student would go from first to second to third. Like all of these things became the same patterns over and over, where you would just see, yes, you're supposed to implement this grant project, but there are all these pitfalls and challenges to actually implementing it to fidelity. And so then what would happen is, without the right amount of money, without the right supports and structures in place, schools literally were doing the best they could to make sure that they were implementing it the best way they could in the situation. So, for example, at one school, they were supposed to be teaching, it was a drafting class, but this was like, let's say mid 90s, mid to late 90s. So drafting is kind of going out of the door, and we're now moving into AutoCAD, right? So more architecture based software. Where the school did not necessarily, they had one teacher that understood that software, and nobody else but her understood how to use it. Then she became very ill. They brought in someone to teach. This person had no idea what AutoCAD was, how to implement it, how to use it in the classroom. So now you have very expensive software that was not being used just because the training of the teacher was lacking in terms of that replacement teacher. And
Mm.
then just the understanding then, okay, well, what does that mean for us to have a school to work program and we're still doing things that are outdated? There is no more drafting and welding. Those sort of things are moving out in terms of career trajectories. And if we're not preparing kids for the next level, then we're doing them a disservice. So, again, just at every level, what I've noticed is that there are very challenging structural things in place. And they've been there for so long that people don't even want to undo them. Like if you go into a traditional high school setting across the US, your traditional public school setting, and you say, let's change the bell schedule, there's going to be upheaval because it's
Mhm.
just the way that we've done it. We just ring a bell every 45 or 50 minutes. If you're really fancy, you might be on block scheduling where it's 90 minutes or an hour and a half. But within reason, we've not really challenged why we do it that way. There's so many minutes for so many credits, and we're just going to keep that simple. And so it's very hard for people to see a way out of
Mm.
things that they know don't work anymore, just to be
Yeah.
completely honest. Yeah.
That makes sense.
Yeah.
And also talking about, the work that you've done with optimal learning solutions, you describe it as helping clients sort of redefine success. So in
Yes.
this world, and you're also talking about, maybe sticking to practices that might be outdated. What does that look like in practice, that work, especially when you're thinking about designing for all learners?
Sure. So when you think about traditional measures of success, you're you're talking about standardized test scores. So what is a school scoring on average? You're talking about maybe things like behavior, how many discipline infractions, how many suspensions in school and out of school. You might be talking about attendance, how the attendance of students, the attendance of teachers, even. Um, how many parents attend parent report card pickup. So you're looking at a lot of quantitative data in most cases. And
Mm.
that doesn't always tell the story of a school. In fact, a lot of that data, what it really shows you is just how under resourced a community or a school is. It's not indicative of bad kids or a bad neighborhood or bad teachers. It's typically, again, we're doing the best we can with the finances that we have, and typically it's kind of the upside down world where the schools that need the most resources end up getting the least. The
Mm.
schools that have kids with the most social emotional needs end up not having enough social workers, caseworkers, counselors, even in terms of standardized tests and where that can get you in terms of college. Well, I've worked in high schools where they did not offer a single AP course. So now, is that student supposed to then compete with a student that has had AP courses since freshman year in high school? Because that's what's happening now, is that the playing field is just so uneven, that that's where I come in and I say, okay, what are your strengths? What are your opportunity areas? Let's start looking at the assets of your organization or the environment. What are you good at? Who's good at certain things that maybe you haven't even tapped into who this person is. And so that's where we come in and we say, okay, let's do some needs assessment. We call it like a design thinking session, really going through what's your mission and how can you align to what your mission is. If your mission is college and careers, then that means you have to literally start from day one of ninth grade. And I talk about high school a lot because it's my sweet spot. I've worked with K through 12 and then even as far as college and graduate, but I really
Hmm.
love the high school space because by that point, a lot of people think that kids have figured things out, and it could be further from the truth. And they think that if they haven't gotten it together academically by then they are they're kind of like on a fixed path. And
Yeah.
I see that as the wrong way to go. I think there's a lot of
Mm-hmm.
movement that can happen amongst adolescents in high school if they're given the right tools and resources and the right adults around them that believe in them and believe in growth mindset. I think you can see a lot of growth from ninth through 12th grade. Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And Dr. Andrea, you've spent years working at the intersection of, like you talked about, curriculum, instruction, and access. So, what really first drew you to this work? I'm interested to learn. And what,
Yeah, sure.
continues to ground your commitment to it?
Mm-hmm. Well, it starts really with my own upbringing, and my parents. They migrated to Chicago from the South. They both from Alabama, and both of them were just committed to education as a way up in life.
Mm-hmm.
And so, my first school was a preschool, a Montessori preschool. And then I went to Catholic school for 9 years. So that was a complete culture shift and culture change.
Yeah, I'm
Um,
sure.
in elementary school, I talked a lot. I got in trouble a lot for discipline, but I was always smart. So that kind of
Mm-hmm.
saved me. And then I went to high school. I tested into a private Catholic high school where I was getting a scholarship to attend. And all of a sudden, the culture shifted. So my elementary school probably was like 99.9% African American. And then I go to a high school that was probably like 5 to 8% African American.
Mm-hmm.
And then I had tested into honors that had even less percentage of African American students. So my freshman year was pretty much spent with me in awe and not talking at all. So my parents were like, well, what happened from elementary school where you were just talking and chatting and now you literally lost your voice. And I felt
Mm-hmm.
like, well, if there are not African American students here in mass, it must be because I don't belong here. And that was certainly not something that was spoken. But I
Mm-hmm.
talk a lot about with my clients the hidden curriculum. So, what are kids noticing about the environment that you're not saying, but you're saying it with the materials that you're using, how you're greeted at the front door, how you're welcomed or not welcome. All those sorts of things are like the hidden curriculum. So, I didn't learn that till later that it was called that, but I
Yeah.
certainly felt like, oh, people are always questioning whether or not I belong. So then I started questioning it. Um,
Mm.
and so my dad started putting together all of this African American history. He put it together in these binders, and he would just like talk to me about it and give it to me and say, read about your history, and you'll see why you belong here. And then my mom was the one who I would say noticed I was smart first in elementary school. And she would in the summer give me books from Walgreens. They were like $1, these workbooks, but she would always give it to me a grade level ahead. And then I would say, well, I'm only in third. Why are you getting the fourth grade book? And she's like, because I know you can handle it. So I had this belief in my own value as a learner. I
Mm.
remember getting books for Christmas. Like I had books under the
Yeah.
Christmas tree, and I would be like, "Oh yes!" The Scholastic Book Fair. So it was just
Mm-hmm.
the culture of my home was that education was important, academics was important, reading was something that we do as enjoyment and to learn more about the world around us. So then I started thinking, well, maybe I could help other people and that would make me feel better. So I went and joined a club in high school where I was tutoring kids from the neighborhood. So even though the school was prestigious and it was very expensive to attend, it was in a neighborhood that had not yet gentrified. So you had kids, low income kids,
Mm-hmm.
coming in for tutoring. And I was tutoring a little boy, and he could barely read, he could barely write, barely do computation, like second grade. I went
Mm-hmm.
home crying, just talking about how unfair that was and how come nobody noticed. And what about his family? How come his parents aren't like my parents? And what about his school? And what about his teachers? And so I just remember this internal rage rising up in me and being like, that's not fair, and I can do something about it. So I
Absolutely.
just have always had that passion to look at the unfairness in education and try my best to attack it from different perspectives.
Absolutely. That's wonderful for sure.
Yeah.
And you also mentioned, talking about cultural experiences and community experiences that students might have that are different from maybe the majority of students at their educational institutions. So
Hmm.
how do you really approach and balance really honoring students' cultural knowledge and community contexts within schools and classrooms?
Yes. That's an interesting question, Harini. I don't know that we've necessarily found the answer. It's very
Mm,
challenging because I think sometimes inherently they feel at conflict with one another. So even when I think about a standardized test or standards based curriculum, that's something that's used a lot now. The question then becomes, well, whose standards? Who
mm,
developed the standards and who said that this was proficient as opposed to this? So in traditional school settings, the cultural knowledge is not often acknowledged. There's not a place for it to live or thrive. And so students either become enmeshed in how do I acquiesce to school culture, because school culture is not going to it is not going to say that what I'm bringing is anything of value. And
mm,
so I have found a lot more, I would say, synergy these days with nonprofit organizations as opposed to schools. Schools will always
mm,
have a spot in my heart, and I think because we have so many kids that go through school, if you want to enact any sort of change in education, you will have to do something at the school level. But a lot of the nonprofits that I've been working with recently, they kind of are partners with schools, so they get the kids that maybe they aren't necessarily good at reading, writing, or math, but they are good at art, or they are good at community leadership and activism, or they are really interested in STEM, um, but they don't have any STEM programs, any STEM classes in school. And so a community organization will then say, okay, Optimal Learning, can you help us to build a program for girls that engages them, that brings in that cultural competence and all those sorts of things? So nonprofit organizations tend to be more flexible, they tend to be more innovative, they tend to they often do a lot more work because they address who's in front of them, as opposed to sometimes even with schools. I've seen teachers, unfortunately, sorry if this is any teacher out there that I'm offending, but I've seen teachers like submit the same lesson plan year over year over year, like, and not even change the date. So you
mm,
know that they're just doing the same thing. And it's like, well, wait a minute though. You have a whole different class, or a whole different graduating class at least, than you had last year, 2 years ago, 4 years ago. So why isn't your planning taking into account all of these things that are happening in the world around us, or even cultural shifts in the community? Because that happens a lot, where it was one neighborhood, and then over the course of 4 or 5 years, things shift, and now you have different demographics, but you're using the same books, the same instructional strategies, and then you're wondering why they're not working.
mm.
And so I think that the community based organizations are a real gem. They are a lot of times underfunded too, but they are a real gem in communities because they get kids, even if they just get them a couple times out of the week for a couple of hours, the Boys and Girls Club, the science centers, and so on and so forth. They still tend to be, they have more flexibility around what does success look like with my programming. It's not based on what percentage of kids can pass a test or what their ACT scores. It's more like, what is the mission of this program? What are the outcomes that you're trying to get at? And how many of your participants can attest to the fact that, yep, this is what the mission was, this is what the outcomes were, and I learned more about this content or this topic.
Awesome. That
Yeah.
that definitely makes sense, and
Yeah.
it's understandable that the different organizations obviously take these different approaches as well to
Yes.
instituting change in their communities.
Yes.
And you, Dr. Andrea, have experience working both, like you mentioned, with these nonprofit organizations and community organizations, and also with schools, of course, with your experience working with Chicago Public Schools and working as a chief academic officer as well for a network of schools. So, what did you learn between these two experiences and different phases, I guess, of your career about enacting meaningful change at scale on a larger
Yes.
level?
Yes, that's a great question. So change takes time. I think there's a lot of research that supports that 3 to 5 years typically is the amount of time that once you start actually talking about, and we've used the word school reform, but sometimes that can have a negative connotation. So any sort of school transformation work, generally speaking, is going to take 3 to 5 years. The problem with that is the public, politicians, policymakers are often looking for quick fixes so that you can get a school from being a failing school to being a proficient school, or getting the average ACT score, higher by 5 percentage points or something to that effect. There's a lot of pressure on schools to move quickly, and there's a lot of competing priorities around that as well. So we really have to give the time and the space for this kind of work to happen. Again, with the financial piece of it, typically the work is underfunded, and sometimes without a consultant, and I'm not saying that all consultants are created equal, because I know that there are some folks that are coming in and they're very top down and they're very much like controlling of the situation. We have the knowledge, you're a failing school, so you need to do what we say. And optimal learning has always had the lens of, we're going to work together, because I want the work to be sustainable once I'm gone. It can't just be the Dr. Andrea show. It has to be something that you all can hold on to. So you have to find champions within the work as well. That takes time to identify potential leaders and then build them up. And then, unfortunately, because this work is so draining, a lot of times we lose leaders, especially the good ones. That 5 year period as a principal is tricky. And if you have a lot of turnover with a principal, it can have disastrous effects on data. So it's hard to try to stabilize situations like that, and that's where the work becomes very difficult. So, yep. So I would say time and more money. Yeah.
Absolutely, for sure. But thank you
Yeah.
so much for sharing your insights with me for this first part. Dr. Andrea and I will be back for a second part of our conversation on this podcast. So thank you.